Okay. This is going to be the one that's going to give me the most heat. So, might as well rip off the band-aid. This is going to be the video where we talk about Jesus. I'm an ex-Christian, and I'm not really going to mince words. I'm just going to get right into it. Here's all the things that I believe that happened with Jesus. And then I'm going to say the things that I don't believe happened with Jesus. Jesus really existed. Jesus really knew and spoke to the disciples, like Matthew and John the Baptist, Peter. And Jesus really carried out a missionary for about 2 years. He died due to crucifixion through a conspiracy by the Pharisees. Jesus did not rise from the dead 3 days later and ascended to heaven. Jesus did not perform any miracles in the way that the Bible describes. Jesus is not God. Most of the disciples did not get martyred because of their beliefs in Jesus, and the Gospels are not reliable. Some of this stuff is going to be written off quite quickly. Some of this stuff requires a very much longer explanation. I'm going to be making a part 2 to this script because the topic of Jesus is so broad, and there's plenty of good arguments that I know because I'm an ex-Christian. I know all the good arguments for Jesus, so I need to split this video up. This part is going to be focusing on all this stuff on the screen right now, and the next part is going to be talking about arguments that people want to give me for Jesus in my response. It's sort of a Q&A style video. Now, in the last part of this video, I'm going to provide like a Mythbusters explanation as to what I believe really happened with Jesus and why it really happened. If I were to prove to a reasonable doubt why the biblical Jesus isn't true, then I'm going to tell my tale on what actually happened, backed by evidence. Well, let me say that again. I'm going to make claims backed by evidence. Was everyone lying? Did everyone hallucinate Jesus? I'm going to get into exactly what I believe happened and why. I'm going to answer, in part 2 of this video, I'm going to answer these questions very directly. Like what happened on the road to Damascus with Paul. Pause to read this. This is going to be part 2. So, real quick, meant to cover that up. For the first time in Bubba's scripts, I have no terms to define. All that we need to get into is to understand the narrative of Jesus in the Bible. So Christianity 101 is what we're going to talk about. Who is Jesus? How was he born? What did he do? And most importantly, what was Jesus? All this information comes from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are a bunch of other Gospels, but they aren't canon, so they don't matter. Let me say that again for the people in the back. The non-canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, they are not canon, so they don't matter. So, Jesus in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, looks something like this. He was born of the Virgin Mary. He was born in Nazareth. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, which is the beginning of his ministry. He recruited the 12 disciples. He presents the new covenant by reteaching what the Pharisees taught about the old covenant. Jesus performs many miracles, like walking on water, feeding the 5,000. Jesus definitely claimed to be God. And Jesus was betrayed by Judas, and he was killed by Pontius Pilate due to crucifixion. He was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and then he resurrects 3 days later. And afterwards, after he resurrected, he appeared to about 500 witnesses, and he ascends into heaven. And then after he ascends into heaven, the disciples spread the word of the gospel message that Jesus taught them, and the disciples were martyred for their beliefs. So, that's who Jesus is according to the Bible. I trust that everyone agrees that I'm being faithful with that description of Jesus. Jesus did all of these things. You see me? Jesus did all of this stuff in the Bible. It's pretty, now let's start with all the stuff that I agree with. The Jesus that I believe is the one that is the most consistent with reality. I'm going to say the things that are true about the biblical Jesus that doesn't call for much discussion. Now, every single thing that I just said, everything on the screen right now, is I'm going to click and we're going to remove all of the supernatural stuff that Jesus did. So all this shit right here is what is true. What is true is about Jesus, born from Mary and in Nazareth, baptized by John the Baptist, recruited the 12 disciples, crucified by Pontius Pilate, all that stuff. That we can say really happened. Now, let's sidetrack. Bubba, I can hear the angry Christians saying in the back of the room, why is it that you're just allowed to believe in this specific part of the Gospels, but not this specific part of the Gospels? You either have to believe in all of it or none of it. The answer is simple. It's rational and justified to separate the theological claims that the Gospels make from the historical claims that the Gospels make, in the same way that I'm able to separate the philosophy from the history of Game of Thrones. It's like a fable. You know the story of the tortoise and the hare? I agree that, yeah, slow and steady wins the race. That's the moral of the story. However, I don't believe that a real fucking rabbit challenged a real fucking hare and they had a real fucking race across a road and that the tortoise actually fucking won. Just like how I can look at the narrative of the Gospels and say that Jesus probably met the 12 disciples born of Nazareth, but he probably didn't walk on water. And he probably wasn't born from a virgin. A lot of texts, like the Bible, has dual genres. It's a theological book, which is baked into a historical narrative. So I can analyze the theology and the history and separate the claims that I make about both of them from one another. That being said, supernaturalism, the belief that supernatural things can occur, the laws of nature can be broken, that applies to things like miracles and divine revelation. It's not true. There's nothing that has ever happened in reality that exhausts a naturalistic explanation. I'm going to get into this a lot more when I do the tag argument script or the precept argument for God's existence. So I'm going to kind of pin this slide and then save it for later. What is real, the real Jesus, is that he would have been a street preacher, rabbi, whatever you want to call him, who recruited the disciples, and he offended the Pharisees so much that they convinced Judas to betray him, and he was crucified by the Romans for his wrongdoing. So that means that Jesus was not born of a virgin, walked on water, and all that other stuff. So, and he certainly wasn't the second person connected to the triune God. Here's all the things that I deleted earlier from earlier. And from that earlier slide, which I said the things that I don't believe in. This, believe it or not, all this stuff is 80% of the Gospels. When you put together all the stories that say, like, born of the Virgin Mary, claims to be God, does divine miracles, resurrects 3 days later, is 80% of the Gospels. I checked. Trust me, bro. I checked. Now, the next obvious question which ought to be asked is, why do I think that this narrative is being pushed? Mythbuster style. Okay. And I said that I was going to do this backed by evidence, so I'm going to fulfill that promise right now. The narrative says this, so why does it say this? The first part of the narrative that I want to address is that the disciples died for their beliefs. The disciples were not martyred for their beliefs. Not all of them. First things first. The narrative is just Christian propaganda. I'm not just saying this out of my ass. I've looked into it, first of all, by Googling. If you look at this website, or this website, or this website, I'll put the links in the description, but they either contradict each other, they don't know, or they're vague, or they provide several options as to what happened. And even when you look at, like this is Overview Bible, by the way, which is, like, Christians love Overview Bible. And it says that we can't say for sure which accounts are referring to the real Philip, and this is about Philip's death. To make matters worse, there are conflicting stories. This is the case with like 3 or 4 of the disciples in Overview Bible. So, we're going to have to look at the early manuscripts. The criteria that we're going to be looking at the text for the early manuscripts is that it had to have been written by a person who was alive at the time of the disciples' death, who witnessed the events take place. That's a very reasonable criteria. So let's go straight back to the early manuscripts themselves. First of all, let's look at James, the brother of John, and Judas. Their deaths are recorded in the Bible. And I can actually give Judas' death in Matthew 27:5 and Acts 12:2. Judas' death is recorded by Matthew, and James's death is recorded in Acts. I will not, however, give James the brother of John because it doesn't pass the criteria. Luke was alive, but he was not a witness to the events of Acts. He did not witness James, the brother of John's death. And I'm going to say exactly why. I don't mean to blue ball you, but I'm going to say exactly why that's the case in the next topic of discussion that I talk about. The most reliable deaths that we have are the deaths of with the criteria that I said, written by a person who was alive and who witnessed it, is going to go to the deaths of Peter and Paul. They're highlighted, the third row and the bottom row. Peter, so from the church father that claims this is Clement of Rome. He records First Clement, if you just look up First Clement, in the year 95 AD. And he was alive. That's when the disciples were alive or would have died, more or less. And this fits the criteria. So, and he records that Peter was crucified upside down and Paul was beheaded in Rome. Every other disciple does not fit this criteria, believe it or not. Apart from Peter and Paul, a text that records exactly how the apostle died was either written by an apocryphal gospel or a person who was born after the disciples died. The other leading sources, which you can see in this spreadsheet right here, and they're all underlined, is from Eusebius of Caesarea and Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria was born at around 150 AD. Eusebius was born at around 260 AD. Far later than any of the disciples died. Only Peter and Paul have a reliable recording of their death by a person who was alive at the time that it was recorded. Well, Bubba, what does this prove? Why are you talking about the deaths of the disciples? That's not even has anything to do with Jesus. Well, here's the thing. Christians present the narrative that the disciples were martyred for their belief in Jesus as a very high piece of evidence that shows that the Gospels are reliable. Because you would not die for something that you knew was a lie. And there's something that I can get behind. That's true. I wouldn't die claiming that dragons are real. So, that's true. However, the narrative is false. If you don't believe me, Google it yourself and get back to me. Because this is the best information that I could find through looking into the manuscripts that claim that the disciples died for their beliefs. These are the best ones. And I fully believe that Peter and Paul died for their belief in Jesus. And I'm about to get into that next, because now it's finally time to talk about the Gospels not being reliable. First things first, I'm going to provide a reasonable doubt as to why this is the case. So here's the criteria that I use in order to determine whether or not something is historically reliable. First things first. Who wrote the gospel? That should be a given. Authorship. When was the gospel written? These two categories are the most important. If you don't pass these, then you fail. If you don't know who or when a text was written, then you have no basis to stand on whether or not it was reliable. The next two categories are pretty standard and very easy to pass, I should say. Who was the Gospels written for and why? What is the audience? What is the context? And the final thing, is it fact or fiction? All the Gospels fail under the criteria of genre. The Gospels are fictional because they claim that the supernatural really happened. However, to a Christian, that's not going to matter. They're going to say it's a historical narrative, a historical nonfiction. So that would mean that it would pass for your typical Christian under the genre category. But if you're an agnostic or if you're not certain, then you would be very reasonable in claiming that the Gospels are mythology or that they're historical fiction or they're fable or fantasy, whatever you want to call it. So, I've said their names a few times, but now I'm going to talk about the reason as to why I think that Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels the way that he is. Why Jesus is talked about as performing many miracles, and he claims to be God. And that all has to do with Peter and Paul. Oops. we have to talk to understand why Jesus is portrayed the way that he is in the Gospels. We have to understand Peter and Paul, the two goats of the New Testament. I don't have to really portray them any differently than they are portrayed in the Bible. Peter was Jesus' most loyal follower. He was a fisherman who met Jesus, and then he followed him in his ministry, and he was his teacher and his mentor. This is evidenced by just how much Peter is mentioned in the Gospels more than anyone else. He clearly had a high leadership status. He probably was the main leader of the disciples, and he was elevated to the position of being the first pope, and he was given to the keys to the church by Jesus. So clearly, Peter was the leader of the disciples who had a very high stake in presenting the narrative that Jesus rose from the dead. And Paul is a person who was persecuting the Christians because he was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee, and he was killing the early Christians. I'm going to answer exactly why, or exactly what I think happened with Paul on the road to Damascus in part 2. But for the sake of this video, Paul had a born-again experience where he witnessed Jesus, and where he believes that Jesus' resurrection was true. And then he does his own missionary work, and he writes the epistles. Now that we've established who Peter and Paul were, here's why Jesus was portrayed in the Bible the way that he is. Those of you who don't know, the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm going to put myself over here. They were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But right now, for this video, we're going to talk about just these two Gospels, Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke, in case you didn't know, never met Jesus. They never experienced Jesus whatsoever in any capacity. I'm going to cover Matthew and John in part 2. How did Mark and Luke obtain their information about Jesus? Mark was a follower of Peter. Luke was a follower of Paul. Meaning that 2 out of the 4 Gospels were not written by an eyewitness of Jesus. That alone should be enough for any reasonable person to deny the Gospel's reliability. That alone throws out the authorship category out the window, because a reliable author of a historical narrative is one that witnessed the events take place. I wouldn't trust my mother to accurately portray to me the events of the Holocaust. She wasn't there. How would she know? How could she possibly know what it was like to be in the gas chambers in Auschwitz? Which is quite an extreme topic, but World War II was the first thing that came to mind. Last part. Who was it that wrote around half the New Testament? Here's the whole New Testament. All of these are books in the New Testament. The answer is Paul. Paul's letters. Romans through Philemon are all letters written by Paul in the New Testament. Paul calls Jesus the image of the invisible God, firstborn in all of its creation, and that our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, giving Jesus the highest amount of Christology by far compared to anywhere else in the New Testament apart from maybe John's Gospel. Peter is a leader of the disciples who was influencing Mark for his Gospel to exist, and he would have done this to build his status as a leader to the early church, to tell everyone his perspective of what happened with Jesus. And Paul influencing Luke in order to recount his events of what actually happened. And not only was Luke not an eyewitness of the events that happened with Jesus, and neither was Paul. It is not said enough that the events of the gospel that Paul didn't witness any of the events that happened to the other gospels. Jesus' first experience with Paul was after his death and resurrection. And now Paul is going around telling people that Jesus is God and his narrative of the events of which everyone ought to worship him. Bullshit. Bullshit. The final statements are this. Conveniently, the only disciples who have a reliable account of the fact that they were martyred for their beliefs, Peter and Paul, are the 2 leaders of the early church who were claiming that Jesus is God. Nowhere else tells a reliable testimony of the disciples' death. The Gospels are unreliable, first and foremost because they claim supernatural events happened in reality, in the natural world, which is good enough for any reasonable person to deny the Gospels as being reliable and say that they're a historical fiction or a fantasy. All four Gospels fail the genre category. Luke and Mark were not written by an eyewitness of Jesus. They were not written by an eyewitness to the events that took place. And as I just said, neither was the person that they were being inspired by. It's like if I were to ask my mother and say, "Hey, Mom, how do you know all these accounts? How do you know exactly what happened in World War II?" And she were to tell me, "Oh, your sister told me." That's bullshit. Therefore, they're not reliable either. That should put reasonable doubt into anyone's mind as to the reliability of the Gospels and that Jesus really was the person that was betrayed in them. But that's all I have for part 1. Bye.